Data, data everywhere. The latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. In Saudi Arabia, Samoa Media published data on the Saudi podcast market. There are 573 podcasters in the fast-changing country, the company says. 33% make shows using video. We'll link to a translated version of their initial findings today in our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Samoa is a podcast production and incubation company and was exhibiting at Ignite the Sound, the first conference for international audio content creators in Saudi Arabia. BBC Sounds, the corporation's app for radio, music and podcasts, has posted a weekly average of 4.3 million users, representing no growth from the previous quarter. It did achieve a record audience of 4.5 million people using it in the week following the UK government's now retracted mini-budget, but the other figures that they post are either flat or down. In Australia, the ABC's annual report was published. The national broadcaster is seeing 33 million downloads per month for its podcasts. They're up 22% year on year. If you compare that with ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia, who are number one according to the Australian podcast ranker, they have just half the downloads of the ABC. In Italy, the results of the Ipsos Digital Audio Survey 2022 were announced. 36% of Italian adults listen to podcasts, up from 31% last year. Squadcast has received a patent for the company's recording engine. The patent relates to simultaneous recording and uploading of multiple files from the same conversation, including drift normalization tools. It's unclear how this affects similar tools like Riverside or Zencaster. Sony Music has been accused of copying the name of a podcast to use for their new show with Emily Ratajkowski. High Low bears a strong similarity, says an IP lawyer, to The High Low, an Acast podcast which ran until 2020. Sounds Profitable has published a deep dive of Triton Digital's new advertising platform, TAP. The product is demonstrated by advertising strategy manager Isabel Lares. On YouTube, Simon Owens interviewed a number of successful podcast creators about building your podcast audience. And the Earbuds podcast collective this week has 5 podcast episodes looking inside cults from someone who grew up in one. It's a Monday, so time for some tech stuff. A group of podcast companies, RSS, Buzzsprout, Transistor, Libsyn and Acast, are working on a project to promote open standards for podcasting. The Podcast Standards Project hopes to launch its website before January's Podfest. Open podcast analytics service OP3 now returns country, continent, region, time zone, metro and ASN. We'll link to some example requests today from the Podnews Daily podcast. And Podverse on the web now lets you export all your user data. It's also partially available in 14 languages, it says, using Weblate. And in podcast news, the Prima Donna podcast has won the Oral History Award at the Victorian Community History Awards. The show brings to life the personal histories and creative work of Australian elder women artists. Truss Issues is a podcast set up to document British Prime Minister Liz Truss's first 100 days in office. It lasted longer than her period as Prime Minister. And Well Adjusting is launched today, a new show to help young people laugh while figuring out life. The show is hosted by Robin Hopkins and part of the Edit Audio Original Network. And that's the latest from our daily newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.